Hello, and welcome to another episode of NASA Science Live, an opportunity for you to interact with our NASA experts, ask your questions, and have them answered in real time. I'm your host, Dr. Mamta Nagaraja, and today I am so excited that we are going to get to talk about the science on board NASA's Artemis I mission. So if you have questions, send them in using the hashtag Artemis on social media or drop a comment in the box wherever you're watching today. So you might have seen the incredible launch of NASA's most powerful rocket from Kennedy Space Center on November 16th. Since then, the spacecraft on board named Orion has completed 2 close flybys of the lunar surface and has flown farther than any other spacecraft built for humans. Yesterday, it finished its return to Earth with a splashdown in the Pacific Ocean. Artemis I is a flight test to prove that the technology all works before we put humans on board Artemis II. But there is a lot of science on board, lucky for us, and we are going to talk about that today. And that science is going to help us learn how humans can thrive in deep space. Now, some of the science has been deployed in the form of Cubesats. And if you've ever heard that phrase, the best things come in small packages, that's pretty much a Cubesat, about the size of a shoebox, fully functioning spacecraft. And some of the science is nestled inside the Orion that splashed down yesterday in the Pacific Ocean. Let's learn more about the science on the Artemis I mission.
Artemis I is paving the way for us to explore deeper and deeper into space.
I think Artemis I is significant on so many levels. It is a new frontier to do science.
So the primary objective is to test the Orion spacecraft integrated with a space launch system.
And it is designed to carry out the boldest of the bold missions.
But it's more than just learning how to travel in space. We're taking a lot of cool science along with us on this first mission to the moon.
So as NASA plans to go back to the surface of the moon and then onto Mars,
we want to spend more time there and that's riskier business. So the more we learn about the moon itself and the environment where we'll be operating, the better we can prepare. We have 10 Cubesats we call secondary payloads, which are small scientific spacecraft of their own that will each be conducting their own scientific mission.
All of these payloads in some form or fashion will help us going forward. They are going to be studying the moon.
And they're going to help us understand, what is the moon made out of? What types of rocks? What types of regolith? What types of ice? What's mixed in with water that might be present?
They're going to be studying the sun,
Understanding and studying the space environment or the space weather.
some different propulsion systems. These novel ideas will ultimately turn into the technology and the systems that we want to use going forward.
There's a lot of cool things going on between all these Cubesats that make up our secondary payloads. Additionally, inside the Orion, we'll be flying an experiment to study space biology.
Space biology is where we study the underlying changes that Earth-based biological systems undergo when they're in space.
Or basically, how does life respond to the space environment?
The level of ionizing radiation that you experience when you go beyond the Van Allen belt, so you go beyond the protective magnetic sphere that we have around us, you then get exposed to higher levels of ionizing radiation. So we are flying several space biology experiments.
We will take a series of materials
Plant seeds, fungi, the yeast cell, algae.
and ride along the trip. And then when it comes home, we can analyze how they responded to that environment.
This research will help us thrive in space. It will help us to go further and stay there longer.
So there you have it. I hope you agree with me. This is exciting. The science we'll conduct on Artemis I lays the groundwork to ensure that we can safely conduct scientific activities at the moon with our astronauts going forward. This really is the stepping stone for us as we take that next giant leap in space exploration.
Artemis I is indeed paving the way for us to explore deeper and deeper in space. And with me today to tell you more about that and answer your questions are those two we just saw in the video. I have Dr. Sharmila Bhattacharya, NASA's Senior Program Scientist for Space Biology and also a personal mentor of mine, and Dr. Jacob Bleachard, NASA's Chief Exploration Scientist. Sharmila and Jake, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting us, Mamta. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Yeah, really exciting times. We have our Orion spacecraft home, but the work's just starting. Really exciting.
Definitely. So that leads me perfectly into my first question for each of you. And Sharmila, I'll go to you first. Is there anything of particularly that's you're excited to learn about as we start getting some of the science back?
Yeah, absolutely. Mamta, for me, all of it, there are, for example, on the package that came back yesterday on the Orion vehicle, there are 4 space biology experiments on a diverse set of organisms, fungus, algae, yeast cell, and plant seeds. And we have never exposed these systems to this unique environment in deep space. So I'm just excited to see what we find and what we learn from all of it.
Yeah, you and I have this shared love of space biology because I too am a space biologist. And I love that we've never done this before. I mean, this is new and novel. And yeah, we're going to learn so much from it. Jake, is there anything particular that you're excited about?
Well, we are now on a path with Artemis, to send our astronauts to the South Pole of the moon, a place that no one's ever been before. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that, right? So learning what the spacecraft has to tell us about the trip it just took is really exciting to me. But I am a scientist, so I really am interested to know what all the Cubesats are going to tell us. They're out there flying through space right now, talking to us, giving us some data back, learning about what the environment was like where we expect our astronauts to go when they ride on the Orion, out around the moon in Artemis II, and then eventually to land on the moon in Artemis III. It's really hard to pick a winner here. It's all exciting.
For sure. But you lead me perfectly, Jake, into my next question. So I'll start with you. With yesterday's splashdown, what science has returned to Earth and what science has stayed in space?
Yeah, so first of all, the most important science from my perspective is what our Orion spacecraft has to tell us. So it's splashed down just off the coast of San Diego, and it's carrying with it just a wealth of data about flying in deep space. This spacecraft just took a trip 1.4 million miles long to get back here to the Earth. And it's basically gone on a trip that will be similar to where our astronauts will go. And as Shamila talked about, it's in places where we haven't really studied what the space environment is like when it interacts with life here from Earth. So we brought back some payloads that came along for the ride with Orion, but we also sent out a series of these secondary Cubesats, we call them. So you mentioned them, the shoebox-sized spacecraft. Each one of those is like its own, science mission out into space. And some of them are looking at the moon. Some of them are learning about the space weather environment, kind of that weather from the sun that we'll have to live in when we go out. Some are traveling out in different trips out into space to study different locations. So we've got a series of those out in space right now. And then we brought back the Orion, and the Orion has some really cool science inside of it as well.
Yeah, so Sharmila, can you tell me more about some of those biology experiments? Did any of them come back to Earth?
Yes. So this is perfect because Jake set the stage for the fact that some of the science went out as secondary payloads, and then as you mentioned, Mamta, some of them came back. So we actually have biology experiments on both. So for the ones coming back then, as we discussed earlier, there are 4 experiments in what we call a suite. It's an instrument called Bioexperiment 1, which actually consists of 4 different experiments with 4 different living systems, which will help us understand the effects of this environment, of the deep space environment, on a diverse number of biological systems. And then we have the one biology experiment in the Cubesat that went as a free flyer. And what's really cool about that one as well is that that one is going towards the sun. So that one is going far, far away from, where we are located and where we've been, in low Earth orbit on the International Space Station. And this payload uses the yeast cell, and it has a really nice way of doing science by looking at the changes on the cell called the yeast cell, the same yeast cell that you use to make bread or beer. And it will experience this environment. Things like radiation will affect its biology in such a way that we can measure that change by looking at growth. And it'll send all that data back by telemetry from deep space. We never have to get that science back. And so we will get all of the information over the next several months as those cells get activated by putting media into them, feeding them, and then watching them grow. So that's one set. And then the ones that came back to Earth, as you mentioned, Mamta, the ones that splashed down yesterday in that amazing video that we just saw, what we're going to do is all of that science will actually be done in the researchers' lab on Earth. So we could get pretty complex with the kind of science analysis we're going to do because the researchers, the principal investigators the teams will get these experiments back in their laboratories, and then they can look at, how did they grow? How did they respond? Which specific genes are responsible for helping us thrive in this novel environment? And when I say genes, I know you know this really well, Mamta, but our DNA inside all of our cells consists of these elements. They're like words inside a sentence called genes. And those genes are what are responsible for making RNA. And then the RNA makes protein, and the proteins do all the work inside your cell. So at the end of this experiment, we'll get lots of valuable information about how these genes function in this unique environment.
Sharmila, you led me perfectly into my next thought, and that's what was going to happen to the science once it's come here. So you told us about the biology ones. Jake, you mentioned, one of the things you're interested in is all the science we're going to get from the spacecraft itself. So what are we going to learn from that, and how are we going to learn from all of that different information we get back?
Sure. So the Orion's been talking to us throughout the entire trip that it took around the moon. So we already have a lot of that data back, and we're starting to work through it. And so what's great about it is the mission went really well. The spacecraft flew well. The space launch system, the big rocket part that made the really spectacular, made it like nighttime into daytime when that thing launched. We got a ton of data from that, and the space launch system performed extremely well. The Orion performed well. We were able to get the mission complete. We even were able to do some additional work along the way. But one of the big parts for the mission was coming back to Earth, coming into Earth at an extremely fast speed, almost 25,000 miles per hour. And as the Orion comes into the Earth's atmosphere, it creates a lot of friction, kind of like when you rub your hands together and they get warm, but like a lot more than that. So it gets really hot. And so one of the big parts we had to study was how to slow the Orion down, because we got to protect our astronauts, our friends who are riding inside. So as the Orion comes into the atmosphere, it heats up. And so we're going to be able to actually look at the Orion now when we take it to back to Kennedy to understand how well it performed and how well the job it did. And then it had some parachutes that opened up that slowed it down for its eventual splashdown, looking at how it performed floating in the ocean, for instance. So we have to be able to get to the Orion to help get our astronauts out of the Orion once it's in the water. So there's a whole bunch of steps that go on there that will work through the data, analyze that data. And it's all very important for us to have the confidence that we need to put our friends in there for Artemis II, which will be another fly around the moon, but with astronauts on board. So it just gets more and more exciting each time.
Yes, it does. And I studied aerospace engineering for my undergraduate degree. So the aeroscience that you just described is so fascinating to me. I love that entire branch of science. So my next question, and Sharmila, I'll start with you. There's a considerable number of experiments that we had on board that were focusing on, and you mentioned this before, the effects of radiation. Why is that so important as we set the stage for future Artemis missions?
Yeah, great question there. So the reason that's important for us to really measure and to understand is that radiation is, simply a reality. I mean, we're exposed to ionizing radiation on the surface of the Earth. We're exposed to ionizing radiation on the International Space Station, and we'll be exposed to a little bit more of that same sort of radiation when we go beyond the Van Allen belts, as you heard in the earlier video. And so it becomes important to really understand what the biological effects, as well as the other effects, actually, the effects on the electronics, et cetera, of this radiation, just so that we are well prepared. We know what to take with us. We know how to counter it. We know what sorts of foods, et cetera, might be able to help protect us, and again, improve us in terms of thriving in this deep space environment.
Yeah, that's great. Jake, do you have anything to add on that too? Because I know there's many different perspectives when we're looking at radiation.
Yeah, I think Sharmila said it right. It's a reality that's part of the environment, right? And just like here on Earth, we have different types of weather on different days. And so maybe some days the weather is not as great for what you want to do, and you kind of plan around it. And that's what we're doing now is we're planning how to do these space missions in the future. And so as we learn about what normal conditions are like, as we learn what maybe non-normal conditions are like, we can understand what the spectrum of that space weather looks like so that we can prepare for it. I used to do a lot of field work here on Earth. I used to study volcanoes, and we used to say, it's not that there's bad weather, there's just bad preparation. And so that's what we do now is we prepare. We learn by flying spacecraft like the Orion, by flying the Cubesats. They're all teaching us about that environment that we have to prepare for so that when our astronaut friends go to the moon, we know as much as we can about it. But, exploration by definition is kind of going into the unexplored. So we will always learn as we go, and then we adapt to that and we plan for the next time we get a shot at it.
Yeah, totally. So even though there weren't any humans on Artemis I, there were a few special passengers that will help pave the way for future missions. Let's take a look and learn more about these passengers.
Inside the Orion spacecraft, as we fly around the moon, we have some cool experiments going on to help us understand what the environment is like.
Although there's no humans aboard Artemis I, we do have a few special passengers aboard that will help us pave the way for future Artemis missions.
So there's basically 3 occupants riding. You can kind of think about it like 3 astronauts. We have a Moonikin. We will also have 2 torsos that are learning about the moon and learning about the environment for our astronauts before they go.
We have a mannequin on Artemis I. We call him our Moonikin for short.
That Moonikin is called Commander Moonikin Campos,
The name is actually in homage to Arturo Campos,
who was an important person who helped bring the Apollo 13 capsule home. The Moonikin will sit in the commander's seat, and it will wear a suit just like our astronauts will wear.
Moonikin Campos is actually weighted to simulate an actual human aboard the Orion spacecraft.
So it will help us understand what our astronauts will experience as they go to the moon and home.
The Orion Crew Survival System suit and the Orion seat were designed simultaneously to fit together as a seamless package. The actual design of the suit was built into the Orion seat such that when they're in the suit, in the seat, it is a true cocoon of protection for them. During this test flight, the seat will actually be instrumented with accelerometers.
Sensors that tell us how much the chair is shaking during launch and re-entry and how many G-forces or gravitational forces it experiences.
We expect Commander Moonikin Campos to have a very exciting ride on his way to orbit. The thrill of launch, the experience of weightlessness, the excitement of landing. What we learn on Artemis I with our mannequins assistants will help us better understand how a human will actually behave in the seat, both for landing and for launch to allow us to ensure their safety.
In addition to the Moonikin, we'll have 2 seats that have basically what's like a human dummy, an upper torso that are detecting how much radiation they're experiencing.
It's called the Matryoshka Astrorad Radiation Experiment, MARE. MARE is an international collaboration with German Aerospace Center, DLR, and with Israel Space Agency. The MARE experiment consists of 2 anthropomorphic phantoms called Helga and Zohar that are simulating a female body in a space radiation environment.
One of those will be wearing a safety vest,
The Astrorad radiation vest.
that we hope will help protect our astronauts from radiation.
Each one of the 2 phantoms will be equipped with about 20 battery-operated radiation instruments.
So between the 2, we'll be able to determine how well we can protect our astronauts from radiation events.
Space radiation is a mix of high-energy heavy charge particles that originate from the sun. To put things in perspective, 1 year of Earth exposure to cosmic rays is equivalent with 1 day of space radiation exposure in deep space. The purpose of the MARA experiment is to learn more about the radiation exposure as well as the biological effects of different organs.
So basically, it's like we have 3 occupants inside Orion that are learning about the moon and learning about the environment for our astronauts before they go.
Going back to the moon with new exploration goals and new technologies will help us gain better understanding of the challenges we encounter with deep space exploration.
We will have to develop new technology and solutions to meet really difficult challenges. But that's what NASA does. That's what Artemis is all about.
All right, so Jake, Sharmila, this is my favorite part of any NASA Science Live. We're about to answer the questions that people have been sending in. They want to know so much about Artemis, so these are some good questions. And I know many of you online have questions, so if you want to use the hashtag Artemis on social media or drop a comment in the box wherever you're watching today, we will get those questions and try to answer as many as we can. So the first one I'm going to send to you, Jake. Chauvin Yenkits 1 on Twitter asks, how will the outcome of the mannequin tests influence what changes are made for the next Artemis mission?
Yeah, that's what it's all about, right? They're out there to help us learn about the environment that our astronauts will travel through. So as we learn about, for instance, what Helga and Zohar have to tell us, they're going to tell us about radiation and whether or not some of the materials that we designed the Astrorad suit out of can help kind of minimize the amount of radiation that they're exposed to. So that will probably influence maybe how we design safety blankets or suits or something that they can wear so that if they're in a situation where they need to protect themselves, they have something to use. It could eventually influence how we design the outside of spacecraft. all of these types of lessons can help us learn about the next technological step we need to take. So it's all important for us. And Commander Campos, he's teaching us a little bit about how the seat designs will work to kind of minimize just how much they're being shaken during their travel. So that helps us understand the interior design of the spacecraft and how the suits are designed to interact with the spacecraft itself. So together, they just kind of help make the ride a little smoother, and also just kind of help us make sure we've got them outfitted with the right gear to safely conduct the missions we'll ask our astronauts to do in the future.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite parts of the science that went up on Artemis I is just having those dummies and all of the collection of that. What are people going to experience when they're in this rocket? It is the most powerful rocket we have. So I find that so fascinating. So let's see. Sharmila, maybe you can take this one. And if I send you a question and you think the other person should answer it, feel free to toss it around. I think we're pretty informal here on NASA Science Live. So at Lugalia and Dega on Twitter asks, will the capsule be reused?
Actually, I am going to hand that over to Jake. I think that's a good question for Jake.
Yeah, so the capsules are designed to be able to be reused. It's one thing that we're doing with the new systems is trying to be able to reuse them. And if it's not the entire capsule, as we continue to develop things in the future, we certainly will learn from each one and develop new systems based off the knowledge that we gain from them. But the intent is for us to be able to reuse those spacecraft when we go forward.
Awesome. Thanks, Jake. Yeah, so Sharmila, I do think that you can tell us more about this one. So Connor on Twitter asks, when can we expect to see all of the data and the science that's stored on the spacecraft and the science? And what kind of data can we expect to see?
Yeah, great question, Connor. Thanks for that. So, it'll depend, as I mentioned, for the science that's come back on Orion, there are 4 different experiments. So there's different analysis that's going to be done on each of those 4 different organisms. Typically, though, the analysis for most studies take about a year from when you get the samples back. Also, don't forget that we have to do a ground control that matches the exact conditions that the spaceflight samples went through. And so usually we do that after return of the flight samples because we have all kinds of sensors and detectors inside the experiment package, which measures, temperature, humidity, radiation levels. There's other changes that are being measured. And so you want to recreate as best as you can, at least the temperature, humidity, gas composition, these sorts of things. And so those will be recreated in the ground control. And then the ground control and the spaceflight samples will both be analyzed and compared to each other so that we can tell what the changes are. So to give you a brief example, for the seeds, the researchers will look at, the seeds that came back from space and that were exposed to this kind of elevated radiation environment. How well did they germinate? How robustly do they grow? Does the addition of these increased amino acid content, does it help it survive better in space? And then likewise for some of the others, for the yeast cells, we'll be looking at what are some of the genes that helped make those cells more robust in this environment, for example.
Yeah, and I think, Sharmila, what's important to note is science takes time to do. And so when we get all of this information, and science has a rigor to it. And the whole reason we have that rigor to it is so that we can be as accurate as possible when we interpret the data that we get. But I think Connor's question also, Jake, can allude to the science and the data, the information, not the science, but the data we're getting from the spacecraft itself. So do you have any insight on when we'll be able to get that information and be able to interpret it and improve the next Artemis missions?
Sure. I mean, some of it's already here. We've been talking to the Orion throughout its entire flight. So Orion's been telling us a lot about how it handles in space. It had to make several different engine burns in order to put it in just the right trajectory. So, one of the great things about the math involved in flying in space is you're trying to balance how fast you're going with gravitational pulls from things like the moon. So as you go out around the moon to stay on course that you want to keep, you have to add a little bit of thrust to your vehicle. So fire those engines off. every one of those gave us more data about how the engines worked, how they performed, how the vehicle responded to that amount of thrust that we gave it. And again, it performed really well, which is exciting to us because that means we're in pretty good shape to start planning for the next Artemis mission, Artemis II. So we're already learning about it. But now with Orion back here on Earth, safe and sound, we can actually go and start to study the Orion itself. So looking at things like how well did the heat shields perform? Was there anything that didn't quite operate the way we thought it did? So those steps, they'll take, weeks, months, even years. I mean, what's great about science is you kind of do the study, right? You do the research, but then it serves as a point of comparison for everything else that you learn. So every time we fly a spacecraft in space, we can compare it to what we learned from this mission to help us better prepare for that next mission. So it's starting now, and a lot of that work will be done over the next weeks to months, but it never ends, really. It'll always be there to help us understand how to fly in space.
Yeah, I love that idea that you just expressed because science does build on top of each other. As soon as you learn something, you come up with another question, and then you think, well, what about this? And it just continues and it just loops. And that's how we end up with this huge body of knowledge. I love that thought, Jake. So I think this one can go to both of you. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on Humberto Silva on YouTube. And I'm sorry if I did not say your name correctly. Wants to know, what is the principal difference between Apollo and the Artemis missions? Sharmila, let's start with you.
Yeah, so one of the things with the Apollo missions is it was still in the early days. That was when we were first, heading back, outside of our own comfort zone, so to speak, and heading towards the moon, and then getting to the surface of the moon. So there was so much unknown that we really had to focus then on, getting there, keeping our astronauts safe, and so on. So there wasn't as much of this very carefully controlled science that we are now sending up on the Artemis series of missions, where, we've sort of, and Jake, I'm sure will further elaborate on this. We have the technologies now, as you've seen on Artemis I, to get there and get back safely. So now we really need to use these platforms to understand the science so that we can be better prepared for our future mission to Mars, for example, which is going to be further than any, human has been, ever. And so I think for me, at least from the science perspective, that's one major difference. But Jake, please add, other perspectives as well.
Yeah, so both Apollo and Artemis, the intention is to put astronauts on the moon. But there are some significant differences. So Apollo was a series of missions that went to near the equator of the moon and all on the near side of the moon. So the side of the moon that continually faces the Earth. So all of those landings were kind of like right in the middle of the moon, as you would see it when you look at it in the night sky. Where we want to go with Artemis is to the south pole of the moon. And the reason we want to go to the South Pole is we've learned so much since Apollo. And what we've learned is that in some cases, there are craters at the poles that never see sunlight. We refer to them as being permanently shadowed. And because of their permanent shadows, they don't interact with the sun. And so materials that we call volatile elements, volatile molecules, that means that if they see the sun, they become volatilized. They turn to gas and they're lost. These volatiles in these places that never see the sun, they just kind of get stuck there. And so over the whole history of the solar system, these volatiles have collected in these cold traps, these permanent shadows. And so what that means is we think there's actually big deposits of ice there. Ice is really important to us. Life needs water. And if there's already water on the moon, it's a resource we can use. If you think about taking a trip here on Earth, you can't possibly take everything with you every time you leave your house. You depend on the fact that a place you go to is going to have a water fountain, right? So we are looking for that water fountain on the moon. And we can use that water maybe for ourselves, but we can break it down into hydrogen and oxygen, maybe even make things like fuel or use the oxygen to breathe. So it is really different, but it's all part of an arc or a trajectory of exploration. It's not that Apollo and Artemis are different than each other. It's just a different stage of learning how to explore deep space. So Apollo did those first trips to the moon, and we learned so much from Apollo. Since then, we've been sending orbiters and landers to the moon from various countries around the globe, learning about the moon. And that's how we learned that water is actually there. And so now we're in this position for Artemis, which is just wonderful, where we can go and start to actually spend more time on the surface of the moon and get to the point where we actually have reusable infrastructure. If we can take something along like a small vehicle that we can drive around, the late Apollo missions took one on each lander, but if we can take one and just reuse it, then we don't have to bring one on each time. And that leaves more space for us to bring other things like more science experiments or to take more rocks home or samples from the lunar surface. So, they're different, but they're building on each other. They're learning, Artemis is learning from Apollo, all the other spacecraft that have been there since Apollo to put us in this just great chance to go explore the unknown.
And I think you touched on it a little bit, Jake, but also one of the great differences between the two is Artemis is really an international cooperative effort. Also, we have lots of partners around the world who are super excited to help the US explore the moon again. I find that really great, fascinating.
Yeah, this is
Yes.
we talk about this. This is not just a NASA thing, right? This is a collaboration. This is a humankind thing, and we're going together. Just on this flight, the European Space Agency provided an element of Orion that helped us steer it and fly through space, the service module. So a piece of that mission came from several other countries over in Europe. And several of the payloads, the secondary payloads we talked about, those Cubesats that went out, were provided by other countries. So all of it is learning how to work together, be partners. What's also neat about it is it's not just international. We're partnering with companies who are building the spacecraft for us now. So the SLS, the Space Launch System, which is the rocket, and the Orion crew capsule, those were NASA spacecraft built with some of our contractors. But many of the future elements, the landers, the vehicles on the surface, they're going to be coming from companies that we all know and know the names of that are going to be building those for us. And so it just really is this wonderful, like I described being at the Artemis I launch as just this like comforting, supportive environment where, just people from all around the globe were paying attention and excited to see what was happening.
There's something so poetic about what you just said. You said we are going together. I don't know. There is just something very heartwarming about that it's all humankind. So Sharmila, I got a question for you here. At Karina Ya on Twitter asks, why did they use yeast and bacteria in their experiments?
Yeah, another excellent question. So, because as we've been discussing, Artemis I is the start, a renewal of a program, within NASA to help us continue to explore these new places. So as a result, the primary goal of this mission was to make sure that we got the rocket and the Orion crew capsule and all of this working safely and effectively. So the science that came along for the ride. NASA is, as is a very heavily science-based and, science-interested organization. And so we didn't want to lose that opportunity to do valuable science, but at the same time, we didn't want to risk the primary goal of this mission, which was to ensure that we could get back to these new environments safely. So therefore, the experiments that we selected to go on these first mission, and the same is actually true for the next mission, is these are more robust organisms. They're very good biological models, though, for doing biology research on Earth. In fact, these have been workhorses that have been used on Earth for many decades now and help us understand fundamental biology about how, genes, within the DNA get transcribed and make RNA and make protein. All of this was initially worked out in systems like the yeast cells and bacterial cells and so on. And so, the intent was to find something that's scientifically very important, but at the same time, very robust. So to give you an example, for some of the experiments, we had to load them weeks ahead of. And in some cases, actually, for some of the free flyers, we had to load the biology months before Artemis I actually launched. So we couldn't really fly experiments that needed, a lot of tender loving care for the cells, because we were not going to be able to access those payloads or those experiments till many weeks or many months before launch. And so the art here was to pick things that would give us very good science, but at the same time would be able to withstand some of the engineering requirements, which required us to do testing on various components of the rocket and the crew capsule before we could do our science. And so that's what went behind the thought of how to pick what kind of science we do.
Yeah, and I think you touched on it for Karina. A lot of what we know about the human body today, if you traced it back, we started learning about it in bacteria or yeast or similar organisms. So we'll be able to learn so much from these, even though they seem like they would be too small or ineffective. They're actually really great organisms for us to learn more about fundamental biology. And I think that's exactly right, Sharmila. So as we mentioned before, Artemis I has a few hitchhikers on board. The idea of these small secondary payloads is to make the most of the Space Launch Rocket System. The Space Launch System rocket, sorry. I knew it did not sound right coming out there. These shoebox-sized CubeSats are not related to the primary mission, but each one will carry out different science and technology demonstrations like you heard Jake talk about before. So from searching for water ice and mapping the lunar surface to technology demonstrations, these CubeSats allow us to learn how to reduce risk and improve our systems overall for future missions. To learn more about the CubeSats on Artemis I and their missions, visit go.nasa.gov/ArtemisScience. Now, let's take more of the questions that you have. And Sharmila and Jake, I've been taking a peek at them, and they're getting even better and better. Such intelligent, insightful questions from our audience today. Let's see. So JJ on YouTube asks, he says, I have two related questions for you. What are the Moonikin phantoms made out of? And at Love Vingem, I think, and sorry about these names if I get them wrong, on Twitter wants to know, why is it so important for us to study radiation of the female body? So Jacob, we'll start with you.
Well, the reason it's important to study it, we have sent people to the moon, but all of the astronauts that went to the moon were men. So it's really important for us to collect some data to begin filling in that lack of information that we have for what happens to the female body when we travel through deep space. So that's one of the reasons that the Helga and Zohar were designed to mimic a female body, so we can collect some of that data. As for what it's made out of, it's made of material to replicate some of the DNA that makes up a female body as opposed to a male body. And so together, going out there, one wearing a protective vest and one not wearing the vest, they can begin to look at what is the result if you have none of that protection versus having some of that protection there. So again, we have some data from our Apollo astronauts that tells us about how the male body responded to that deep space environment. And now we've collected some of that information with Artemis I to help fill out and have a more robust understanding that actually represents our astronaut, the breadth of our astronauts today.
I'm so glad they asked those questions, because I didn't even think about why we were modeling and had these female mannequins on board, but that makes perfect sense now that you say it, Jake. All right, so for you, Sharmila, at Simone Jo Moore on Facebook asks us, with the bio experiments, are we also looking at how we might need to bio-adapt and not just protect as we are?
Yeah, another great question, Simone. So Yes, adaptation is definitely, especially as we're going to do long-term space exploration in the future, going to Mars and back is going to be something like a 2 to 3 year round trip. And then, coupled with that, time to stay on Mars. So we are increasingly going to have to look at spending more time there. So yes, some of the studies are definitely going to begin to look at that. But remember, this was a relatively short duration trip because, again, we wanted the capsule back. Having said that, Sentinel experiment that I mentioned that is going towards a heliocentric orbit, that one, for example, is going to look at longer term exposure. And so we're going to look at almost 6 months or more. As long as we can get the data back, we will continue to do that research. And so you're absolutely right. Some of the changes that we will be looking at are the immediate changes, and therefore, what can you do? What can you learn from some of that? But then some of the data will actually point towards the long-term changes, which will hint more towards, how do you acclimate? And over many generations of cell growth, how do you actually adapt to these environments? So yes, great question. Yes, those are definitely along the lines of what we're interested in for the science.
That's great. Thanks, Sharmila. Okay, Jake, I've got a great question for you. It sounds like a lot of people online are asking about Snoopy. So Jake, do you know how he's doing, and can you explain his role on the mission?
Yeah, so Snoopy's long been associated with our astronaut flights. He's always been a part of that. I think he's just kind of a recognized part of human nature. He's always flying around on his doghouse, and he leads the way for exploring. And so he's always participated with NASA. And his specific job on the mission for Artemis I is to help us understand when we're out of that gravitational field. So when you see Snoopy starting to kind of float up around, you know that you now are no longer in that gravitational field. And in fact, when you look at any NASA launch with KHOU, they have one of these gravity indicators as well. And sometimes they bring along a memento that means more to them. But on this flight, this important flight, Artemis I, Snoopy's the ride along for us. So Snoopy came home in the Orion, splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, probably has some really awesome stories to tell us, but for sure has been telling us what the gravitational field is like during the Artemis I mission.
I love that, Jake. Oh my goodness, Snoopy is beloved in our culture for sure. Let's see. So a viewer on Twitter asks, and Sharmila, I'm going to hand this one to you. Will there be something like the DNA sequencer that is used by the astronauts on the International Space Station? And if used on the Orion for Artemis 2 and 3, could it determine radiation damage to microbes on board Orion? I told you these questions are getting tougher and they're awesome. Yes.
Yes, fabulous question. And so the answer is absolutely yes. So, over time, we are in fact exactly going to be doing what you suggest, which is we're going to be taking up more and more of the tools that we use on the International Space Station, for example, which really help us to do our science so we can do it, on the surface of the moon, for example. Having said that, let me also tell you that one of the experiments on that Bioexperiment 1 suite, one of them is specifically going to look at what we call omics changes, which covers exactly what you're asking, which is if you sequence the RNA, for example, and you look at what is called transcriptomics, it gives you a sense of how the DNA and those genes inside the DNA, how do they respond in this novel environment? And so we are going to do that, for example, and we're going to get that information, but it is going to be done on the samples that have come back to Earth this time, because Bioexperiment 1 is coming back, has come back, and most of the science is going to be done on the ground. But again, that, what you say, that is real-time sequencing in space, on samples that are flying in space, can absolutely be done, and definitely is something that we're going to do. And the other advantage of doing what you suggest is that many of these operations are usually automated. And so the more automated we can make it, the easier it will be for us to do the science in future on the lunar surface. So absolutely, yes. Yeah, great question, and totally on the right track for what we're interested in doing.
I agree. That was a great question from our Twitter audience. Let's see, Jake. This one is from Electroboy8128 on YouTube. He asks, when will Artemis II launch?
Yeah, so Artemis II, if everything continues to go well for us, we're expecting to be able to launch Artemis II in the year 2024. So we need a little bit of time to just make sure we understand exactly how Orion performed and the SLS, the Space Launch System, performed. As we pull all that information together, we'll begin planning that next Artemis launch. So Artemis II in the year 2024, we'll have our astronaut friends on board, and it's going to do something similar. We'll fly out around the moon, and it will teach us again about how to fly out in that deep space environment, what that environment is like. But this time it'll be super cool with the astronauts on board. They all have to bring along stuff like water and food and clothing. So we're going to really start to load up the Orion and see how it handles when it's carrying more of the mass that it can. So like, if you think about driving your car maybe to school or to work, you probably don't load it up. But if you're going like across the country to visit somebody, you really pack all your stuff in there. And so ultimately, Orion will need to do that on its flights to the moon. And we have to learn, like the prior question about the types of science we might carry. So we need to learn how much mass we can carry along with us. And as we learn how well the vehicle performs through these test flights, that will teach us how to pack it, how much we can put in there, how much science we can take along. And it's all part of this whole process of learning as we go and learning with each flight and learning from the science that we take along that puts us in a position to do the next flight. So 2024 is our goal for flying that Orion with some astronauts inside.
Yeah, and all three of us are parents, and I bet a bunch of our audience too. And we all know that 2024 might seem like it's a long way away, but when you think about it, it's like right around the corner. So it's really not that far away. I start measuring things in terms of how tall my children get overnight. So I know 2024 is not that far away. Let's see. Humberto Silva on YouTube asks, and this is for both of you. Jake or Sharmila, we'll start with you. What is the most difficult thing to do on this mission?
Ooh, great question. So one of the things that Jake alluded to in the previous question was that this one doesn't have crew on it, right? Because this is the test flight, sort of validate all the systems work and everything is nominal before we put crew in there. So one of the things that this made it a bit of a challenge, if you please, for doing science is that, unlike on the International Space Station or in the Space Shuttle in the past, or on the Mir space station, where you always had astronauts or cosmonauts or people there, the crew was helping us do science, right? They were our research assistants and our technicians doing the research that we needed done. This one, though, didn't have that assistance. So we had to figure out ways in which you could either automate the experiments like we did for BioSentinel-1, or where you would do the bulk of the very complicated analysis after you get it back, which is what we're doing for Bioexperiment 1. So I would say that would be one of the, challenges. Again, in a way, I wouldn't even call it a challenge, because the more you're forced to think of innovative ways and different ways to do science, the more you come up with intriguing, novel ways to look at the same thing. So I think, in spite of all of that, we've managed to get quite a nice collection of science experiments on board. But certainly that was something we had to contend with as we were doing our planning.
That's great. Jake, What do you think? What is the most difficult thing on this mission?
Well, I think the one thing I want to do is give a big, huge shout out to all of our engineering teams that worked on this. I think you can see a launch and you can see a spacecraft splash down in the ocean, and you might think a few people worked on that, right? But the number of people that worked on this, and they're divided up into teams who work on specific steps along the process. I think if you talk to any one of them, they would say whatever the part was they worked on was probably the hardest part. And they're not wrong, because all of the steps have to work seamlessly together to make a mission like this work. And I don't just mean the engineers that worked on the spacecraft. I mean the engineers that built the Cubesats, that built the payloads like Sharmila was talking about, that rode inside Orion. The tremendous amount of work that went into making this mission a success. There's not enough credit to hand out. But so many steps, assembling the whole vehicle inside the vehicle assembly building, stacking these pieces of the rocket together and then putting the Orion on top, rolling it out to the launch pad. The launch obviously is a spectacular moment where a whole bunch of things got to go right. But once it got up into orbit, getting the solar array deployed, moving the Cubesats out, deploying the Cubesats, every one of those steps, taking Orion, there were a bunch of, I mentioned already, a bunch of engine burns we had to do to keep it in the right trajectory. Every one of those has to go well. It's when you are watching this and working inside NASA, you see these handoffs, right? It's like we complete a step and now this engineering team's nervous because they got the next thing. And then this engineering team is nervous because they've got the next thing. And every single one of them just nailed it. So, every step is hard. Space flight it's a tough business, but we learn, and we've learned from all the predecessors. I like to say, the Isaac Newton phrase, we stand on the shoulder of giants, and it certainly is true here. Each one of these groups just, their step performed phenomenally and puts us in a position to send astronauts to the moon.
Yeah. And as President Kennedy said, we do it because it's hard. This is what drives us. Challenges, right? Humanity's greatest challenges. That's what drives us. All right. So let's see. Travis Ramirez on YouTube asks, if you could go back and add one thing to the Artemis I mission, what would it be? Sharmila, we'll start with you.
Ooh.
Let's see what's question.
Yeah, that's really making us think here. What is the one thing that we would add?
Well, if you want me to give you a moment to think, Sharmila, I can give you an answer. Now that I know the mission went so well and everything performed phenomenally, the one thing I'd add would be some astronauts. But we didn't know that when it started. It was a test, and we had to make sure it all worked well. But I know a whole bunch of people who would have been happy to sit inside that thing knowing that the ride went well,
That's an excellent question, answer, Jake. I'll tell you, I would have said that let's add science, but we added a lot of science. So, we also had these mannequins, as Jake talked about, which is so valuable. We really need that information as we get prepared for the next crewed mission. So, Snoopy, we can't do without Snoopy, so Snoopy was in there, check. So really, I can't think of anything further that I would have done or something I would have done differently than how this was done. So as Jake said, hats off to the whole team for thinking through this mission so carefully and really being able to check all the boxes at the end of the day.
If there's one thing else I could add, I think one thing I would love to have been able to do is just have everybody be able to watch the launch, and so Artemis is going to be a series of launches. And so I hope that everybody out there that, is interested in this stuff gets a chance to see one of these launches, whether it's from far away. I mean, you could see this one from pretty far away. But it's an amazing event to see something like this, to launch a vehicle. And it will be even more so when we know our friends are going along for the ride. So, I hope everybody gets a chance to be involved in Artemis. There will be many opportunities going forward. So that's one thing I would definitely like to see.
Well, I think this is the perfect way to wrap up our show. That's all the time we have left today. I completely agree that it was so successful. We had so much science on board. All we were missing were astronauts. That is the perfect way, best lead into Artemis II coming in 2024. So Sharmila, Jake, thank you so much for being with us today, answering all of these questions, the super creative, intelligent, insightful questions that our audience asked today.
Yes, thank you all so much for the questions. Thank you for hosting. It was a real pleasure being here today. Thanks.
Yeah, and I hope I didn't sound too excited. It's really hard to control right now with so much cool stuff going on. But I just want to say to all especially the younger folks out there, early career engineers, scientists, technologists, and all the kids out there, stay curious, stay excited about this stuff. I mean, we're doing this for you. You're the ones who are going to take this and go explore the stars and the solar system. So we're taking these first baby steps for you. I hope you're coming along after us and really take it out there.
Jake, we love your excitement. That is the perfect way to end our show. So if you want to learn more, visit nasa.gov/Artemis1. And to stay updated on the program and Artemis, you can follow at NASA Artemis on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if today's show piqued your interest and Jake and Sharmila left you wanting to know more, there is a spot for you for science too. You can follow at NASA Space Sci on Twitter for the latest experiments and results. Thank you so much for joining us, asking the best questions, and we'll see you next time.
What an exciting day at the Kennedy Space Center. You can see the Orion spaceship coming out of the ONC building where we've been assembling it for several years. As big a step as this is for us today in rolling out and starting the journey of Artemis I to the moon and beyond, we're really excited for this test program to get this vehicle flowing and to begin the next steps, which are to send humans back to the moon.
The twin sister of Apollo, Artemis is the name given to the program that will return humanity to the moon. And named after one of the largest constellations in the sky, Orion is the spacecraft destined to get us there. Through Artemis missions, NASA will land the first woman and the first person of color on the lunar surface. And these missions will allow us to explore more of the moon than ever before, paving the way for long-term presence in lunar orbit.
We're rolling the Orion spacecraft out, but it's beginning its journey. We're really kind of at the end of the building process and the beginning of getting ready to go fly.
But before Orion can travel to our nearest celestial body, it must first make a few pit stops along the way to fuel up and get ready for flight.
As we leave here today, we're going to go to a facility that'll fuel the spacecraft with the rocket fuels and propellants it needs. We'll put a launch abort system on. We'll send it out to be stacked in the rocket and launched. And it's really the last few yards of the game.
Orion's journey to the moon began on the bayou. NASA's KHOU assembly facility in New Orleans is where technicians with Lockheed Martin began welding the pieces of the spacecraft's underlying aluminum structure together. 1 year later, it arrived in Florida, taking up semi-permanent residence inside the Neil Armstrong Operations and Checkout Building at NASA's Kennedy Space Center. Engineers and technicians will spend the next years working almost around the clock, outfitting Orion with thousands of components and pushing the capsule through several rounds of rigorous testing as teams prepare for its flight around the moon. The first step, though, is the crew module's arrival.
When the crew module shows up here at the ONC building, it's really just a welded shell of the structure. When it gets here, we put it into a fixture called the bird cage tool, and we use that fixture to position and attach all of the mechanically attached primary and secondary structure for the crew module.
Part of that includes the heat shield, which protects the crew module as it blazes through Earth's atmosphere at astonishing speed as it returns home. Technicians with Lockheed bond those thermal protection system products onto the heat shield right here in the ONC. And they do the same for the crew module's forward bay cover.
We bond that on here, and basically this covers the forward bay of the crew module, such that once we come back into the atmosphere, this gets jettisoned and all of the landing system, i.e. parachutes, get deployed and slow the crew module down so that when it touches down in the ocean, it's only going a few miles an hour.
With the primary and secondary structures all attached, the crew module is tested to see how everything holds up. Orion is pressurized, stressing the welds to ensure they'll hold up under the proper loading. Afterwards, non-destructive evaluation of those welds is conducted to check for any voids or cracks. Once the structure is deemed strong enough, the crew module is moved just a few spaces down into the ONC's clean room for its next round of integrations.
We bring that structure into our clean room, which is you see behind me, because we need to start integrating the propulsion system and elements of the environmental control and life support subsystems, and those systems require a cleaner environment than the one we're standing in out here.
When all of that is done, the crew module is on the move again to the crew module integration station. There, all of the electrical systems, including wire harnesses and avionics boxes that control the crew module's guidance, navigation, communications, and its power subsystems, are integrated. Next, it's time to bring the spacecraft to life.
We power it up, and then we go into a whole series of functional tests to make sure all the subsystems that we've integrated up to that point are functioning properly.
But the crew module isn't the only thing that makes up the Orion spacecraft.
All the people, the work, the components that have gone into this vehicle, it's just an amazing feat.
Teams also worked closely with the European Space Agency to build the service module, the element that will power Orion on its journey around the moon. Once that arrives from Bremen, Germany, Lockheed moves forward with integrating the two.
The service module has a very similar life cycle to the crew module. We build it up structurally, we integrate the propulsion system and the other fluid systems, and then we integrate it electrically and power it up and do functional tests on it. And when we have a full service module and a full crew module, then we stack the two together and we have what's called the crew service module for Artemis I.
Under the Artemis program, NASA plans to not only return to the moon, but to use that as a stepping stone to go farther than any human has ever gone before, Mars. To get there, it's truly a cross-country and international effort among thousands of individuals.
When you consider all the people, at the Johnson Space Center, Marshall Space Flight Center, all across the agency, SLS, Orion, the European Service Module, Boeing and their team, Lockheed Martin and their team, and to see all of that come together on that launch when we send it on its way to the moon, it's going to be absolutely amazing, and we're going to have a lot of really proud, happy people.
Building a spacecraft destined for deep space exploration from the ground up is no easy task. And the fact that these teams have been able to come together and do just that in the midst of a global pandemic is nothing short of amazing.
You know, it really is a testament to the workforce. If you think about what we've been through over the years that they've been putting this together, and particularly think about the environment that this team was dealing with. We're dealing with COVID, and we're asking these folks to come into work every day and finish the spacecraft so we can keep this mission going. And we're ready, and we're excited. And so as they turn this over to us, we're ready to get going.
And really, this is only the start of Orion's path to the pad.
It's a little hard to put into words when you think about the fact that we are in the first flow of what will be our nation's deep space exploration program. It hits you in the heart, and it really speaks to why we all are doing what we're doing.
I never thought as a little kid growing up I'd be part of something like this today. Now as a dad of 2 young girls, to be able to tell them what I do and to be able to have them someday watch the first woman stand on the moon is pretty amazing to me personally.
As the Orion spacecraft departs the O&C, its next stop is the Multi-Payload Processing Facility, or MPPF, where teams with NASA's Exploration Ground Systems and prime contractor Jacobs will perform the next set of milestones, fueling and servicing the spacecraft.
We have a few months of hard but rewarding work ahead of us to get to launch, but this is it. This is our year. This is our time and what folks have worked so hard for.
Now we're going to continue with processing, get that thing checked out, fueled, get the launch abort motor stuck on top of it.
With fueling of Orion's crew and service modules complete, the spacecraft moves from the MPPF into the Launch Abort System facility.
We just finished fueling the spaceship, and we moved it to the LASA facility, the Launch Abort System facility, to put the Launch Abort System on the top of Orion.
And in July 2019, teams completed a critical test, the Ascent Abort 2 flight test, to validate the Launch Abort System works as expected. After reaching an altitude of about 6 miles, where the test spacecraft experienced high-stress conditions expected during launch, the abort sequence triggered. Within milliseconds, the abort motor fired to pull the crew module away to safety. Its attitude control motor flipped the capsule into the proper orientation, and the jettison motor fired to release the crew module for a splashdown in the Atlantic Ocean.
I feel, just honored and humbled every day to be able to work on this.
This rocket is just going to be absolutely amazing.
Now that the spacecraft's launch abort system is securely in place, Orion is ready for the next stop on its path to the pad, the Vehicle Assembly Building. Once inside, the spacecraft will be placed on top of the Space Launch System rocket, the most powerful rocket the world has ever seen.
50 years ago, we pioneered a path to the moon. The trail we blazed cut through the fictions of science and showed us all what was possible.
It's very pretty out here.
Today, our calling to explore is even greater. To go farther, we must be able to sustain missions of greater distance and duration. We must use the resources we find at our destinations. We must overcome radiation, isolation, gravity, and extreme environments like never before. These are the challenges we face to push the bounds of humanity. We're going to the moon to stay by 2024, and this is how.
This all starts with the ability to get larger, heavier payloads off-planet and beyond Earth's gravity.
For this, we designed an entirely new rocket.
The Space Launch System. SLS will be the most powerful rocket ever developed.
And with components in production
and more in testing,
this system is capable of being the catalyst for deep space missions.
We need a capsule
that can support humans from launch
through deep space and return safely back to Earth.
For this, we've built Orion.
This is NASA's next generation human space capsule.
Using data from lunar orbiters that continue to reveal the moon's hazards and resources.
We're currently developing an entirely new approach to landing and operating on the moon.
Using our commercial partners to deliver science instruments and robotics to the surface, we are paving the way for human missions in 2024.
Our charge is to go quickly and to stay, to press our collective efforts forward with a fervor that will see us return to the moon in a manner that is wholly different than 50 years ago.
We want lunar landers that are reusable,
that can land anywhere on the lunar surface. The simplest way to do so is to give them a platform in orbit around the moon from which to transition.
An orbiting platform to host deep space experiments and be a waypoint for human capsules. We call this lunar outpost Gateway.
The beauty of the Gateway is that it can be moved between orbits.
It will balance between the Earth and Moon's gravity,
in a position that is ideal for launching even deeper space missions.
In 2009, we learned that the moon contains millions of tons of water ice.
This ice can be extracted and purified for water. It can be separated in oxygen for breathing or hydrogen for rocket fuel.
The moon is quite uniquely suited
to prepare us and propel us to Mars and beyond.
This is what we are building.
This is what we're training for.
This we can replicate throughout the solar system.
This is the next chapter of human space exploration.
Humans are the most fragile element of this entire endeavor, and yet we go for humanity. We go to the moon and on to Mars to seek knowledge and understanding and to share it with all. We go knowing our efforts will create opportunities that cannot be foreseen. We go because we are destined to explore and see it with our own eyes. We turn towards the moon now, not as a conclusion, but as preparation, as a checkpoint toward all that lies beyond. Our greatest adventures remain ahead of us. We are going.
We're going.
We are going.
We are going. We're going.